Hello everyone and welcome to tonight's webinar, Understanding and Enhancing Sexual Desire in Your Marriage. My name is Zoe Kessler and I'll be your host this evening on behalf of PsychCentral.com. Now before we introduce tonight's presenter, I'd like to remind you that the webinar, along with a library of past webinars, will be accessible online at Psych Central's YouTube channel later this week. And that address will appear at the end of tonight's session. Tonight's session will consist of a 40-minute presentation followed by a question and answer period. And during the Q&A, please just type your questions in the question panel and we'll try to answer everyone's questions, but we'll also do our best to wrap up the session within an hour. And now I'd like to introduce tonight's presenter, Dr. Suzanne B. Phillips, and I am just delighted she could join us. Let me tell you a bit about her. Suzanne is a licensed psychologist, psychoanalyst, a couples and certified group therapist. She's also an adjunct full professor of clinical psychology at LIU Post in New York and has a number of other teaching positions. She's the co-author of 3 books and over 25 articles, and most recently she co-authored Healing Together, a couple's guide to coping with trauma and post-traumatic stress. And of course, she is a blogger for Psych Central. The name of her blog is Healing Together for Couples, and I'll tell you, looking at some of her blog titles, I am really hoping that some of my peeps are going to be joining us tonight because some of the titles are Enhance Intimacy, Lessons from Long-Distance Relationships, Overreacting in Your Relationship. Well, I write a blog about ADHD, and we certainly are hypersensitive emotionally. Cyber sex addiction, challenges to relationships and recovery. So these are terrific topics, and I don't know if we'll touch on any of them. Tonight's session is going to be wonderful, understanding and enhancing sexual desire in your marriage. So without further ado, I am going to say welcome, Suzanne, and I know you're standing by.
Thank you so much, Zoe, and thank you all the listeners out there. We're going to be talking about some very important and interesting topics, and I hope that you're able to relate to the material we'll be sharing. We are ready to start. So let's start with the question, what is sexual desire? If we look at the word desire itself, we know it means a wish or a longing for something. And when it comes to sexual desire, we're talking about what we might think of as a motivational state, but also a wish, a need, a drive to seek out sexual objects or to engage in sexual activities. And particularly, we're thinking about this in terms of our partner in a marriage situation. Now, what we're finding is that marital satisfaction really is very subjective, but most people feel that it really has to do with the satisfaction of their needs, their expectations, and their desires. And part of this, we find, research tells us that sexual satisfaction is a very important component of marital satisfaction. We have 40 million Americans who are living in low-sex or no-sex relationships. That's a lot of folks, and I can see in the folks that I'm dealing with, very often partners feel deprived, worried, resentful, guilty. They're not sure how to recapture the intimate connection that's been lost. Many want to, but they're not sure where to start. Now, if we look at those folks who've written about marriages, some of them say one of the problems is that we want it all. If you look at the work of Stephanie Coontz, author of Marriage, A History, How Love Conquered Marriage, she suggests that one of the problems is we live in a culture that's never been more tolerant of sexual mores outside of marriage. But we want from marriage both social and sexual monogamy. We want it all. We want the guy that we're married to or the woman that we're married to often hold on to a profession or a job, help us with the kids, do the carpooling, find out a way to have dinner, and at the same time be erotically interesting. That's not that easy. We call it the marriage desire paradox. In some ways, Stephen Mitchell, who writes about Can Romance Last, he says, here's our problem. We need people to be familiar enough for us to trust them, but they've got to be a little bit like strangers or we're not going to be turned on by them. And many of you might know the work of Esther Perel, who says one of the problems is that we're mating in captivity. So is it possible? This comes from a New Yorker cartoon. And do you, Mary, promise to make love only to John month after month, year after year, and decade after decade until one of you is dead? It sounds tricky. I'm going to suggest to you tonight that it's possible, it's complicated, and it's worth having. Very often I have found that partners feel very positively actually about each other and their marriage. They don't want to leave their marriage, but they can't find their sexual connection. Very often, we used to say, you know, all of the fighting about outside issues gets played out in the bedroom. These days, I think lots of what doesn't happen in the bedroom gets played out in negativity and fighting and resentment and differences over issues that really have nothing to do with sexual connection, but everything to do with the fact that no one's talking about the sexual connection. Partners are often unaware of what we're going to talk about tonight, the internal and external factors that dampen their sexual desire. Let me ask you this. Do you think you and your partner are mutually satisfied sexually? If you're not really sure, you're not alone. Research and clinical work suggests that most men and women find it actually very difficult to speak with their partner about sexual relationships. In one study, 9 out of 10 men had a hard time articulating needs and desires to their partner. Half of the women in the study had a difficult time. It seems that people would rather go through the motions in an obligatory way or avoid it than talk about it. We talk about sexless marriages, but my question is whether they're sexless by design or default. It seems to me that we have to start this by saying there are some couples who are not interested in sexual connection. They're intimate, they may connect in many other ways, and we have to register that really couples have the call on this. If they're happy, they're the only judge of what works in their marriage. But very often, couples are sexless because nobody's talking about it, and then we consider that they're really sexless by default. Okay. All right, let me just see. Okay. Do any of these sound familiar? He's worried about performance, so he makes no overtures. She feels rejected but says nothing. She fears that she's lost sexual desire and avoids responding by going to bed earlier or later. He's quietly resentful. He sees her dress up for work and wishes she would dress up more when she's with him, so he holds off on his compliment. She thinks a lot about him when she hears music in her car, but by the time she's home and the kids and the chores start, the mood is gone and it goes unmentioned. I'm having a little trouble with my clicker here. All right, let me see if I got it. There I go. Okay, what makes sex so difficult to talk about? Well, from what I can tell clinically and from what I've read, many couples don't talk about it because they fear being rejected or rejecting their partner. Based on cultural stereotypes, some partners presume that if they say, let's talk about sex, or they start talking about sex, it'll equate to wanting it, or the other's wanting it, or they'll get worried that the other wants sex with someone else. Partners often don't want to embarrass, hurt, or create tension, so they don't mention that the old robe is a turn-off, or that groping really isn't the best form of foreplay. They won't mention it as an attempt to protect their partner. Paradoxically, to keep the peace, they quietly comply, disengage, ignore, withhold, worry. Sometimes they wander. Stephen Mitchell gives us one possibility, which I find very interesting. Why can't we talk to this person who's so close to us? He suggests what makes intense desire, sexual and otherwise so dangerous and difficult to talk about, is that it entails a longing for something important from a unique someone whom one has allowed to become important. So the stakes are high with our partners. We're actually more cautious with them. Now, I know a lot of people say, yeah, but when we met it was so good we didn't even have to talk. You're right. Dr. Marian Legato, who's the wonderful author of the book Why Men Never Remember and Women Never Forget, she tells me that in early romantic love, that's the time when men and women are most neurochemically matched. Early romantic love erases the differences between men and women physically and psychologically for a short period of time. The testosterone is high for both, and they're both feeling the same thing. They are infatuated. They can't stop thinking about each other. They can't think of anything else. They're up at night. They're obsessing. Neurochemically, it's a real natural high. And what we know after the fact is that infatuation at that point blinds us to our new partner's faults. Now, Dr. Helen Fisher tells us, you really don't want this to last forever. It's not adaptive to be intensely romantic in love for 20 years. Actually, we'd all die of exhaustion if that were the case. I'm having trouble with my slides. Okay. Let's see if this helps. That said, lovemaking is fundamentally a present moment experience. At any age, I'm going to suggest to you, and no matter how many years you're married, sexual connection can be fueled by imagination and spiced up by fantasy. A relationship over time can have depth as well as a meaningful sexual connection. New experiences, and this is going to be relevant for our strategies tonight, new experiences at any point activate the brain's reward system, flooding it with dopamine, norepinephrine, and igniting those same circuits we found in new romantic love. So here are some of the factors that people don't really account for. We're going to talk about each of these: gender differences, physical and emotional roadblocks, the impact of culture, media, and myth, the assault of trauma and infidelity, the realities of everyday life, stress, exhaustion, the institutionalization of our relationship, the lack of romance, and desexualized roles. Let's talk about the gender differences. In one study, a very interesting finding suggests that men and women really want the same thing. They just want it in different ways. Men reported they wanted to be seduced and they wanted to be loved and valued. Women reported they first wanted to be loved and valued and then they wanted to be seduced. So we see everyone wants to get to Rome, but they want to go in a different way, something it's worth taking note of. Now, another interesting book, which is Why Men Don't Listen and Women Can't Read Maps, suggests that when it comes to sex, men need a place, women need a reason. And maybe that's a little simplistic, but actually men and women are different in terms of arousal and desire, something they often don't account for. Where men's desire is driven by their physiology. And then Dr. Legato tells me that when she asks her men patients, they say, oh, they're thinking of sex all the time. And if they're not, there's always a visual trigger that's going to get them to desire and to feel aroused. That's not really true with women. Rosemary Basson, in some really important work, she found out with women it's different. With women, it's about context, the mood they're in, the nature of the relationship, what's been said to them, etc. And this becomes a really important point because it means that women may not initiate sex because they don't feel arousal. They don't feel desire until they feel arousal. They have to enter into a sexual situation in order to feel the arousal and then the desire. So in some ways, men often complain that women don't initiate. And it's maybe instructive for both to consider. In a very important book, The Tired Woman's Guide to Passionate Sex, Lauren Mintz says, you know what, to build up our desire as women, even if it's for a minute or two a day, we have to really think about sexuality. We have to remember the last good sexual experience. We have to, in some way, out-trump the way we're wired so that we're not always in what seems to be a withholding position. It's worth men knowing that maybe women actually do have to be romanced before they can be actually physically sexual. Now, everyone's heard this before. What might be new is actually taking it into account in your behavior with your partner. Another thing that really men and women are different about is the way they're portrayed in the culture, the media, and the myth. In our culture, the big myth is that men are the folks who always want to be sexual and women are the ones with the headache. But actually, when we look close, we find sexual desire in marriage is a problem for both. In one book by the Berkowitzes, one of the things they explored was the sexless male, the sexless husband. And what they found is that in 44% of the cases, the male had stopped initiating. He had stopped being sexual. The woman often had no idea why. When he was asked why in the survey, he reported things like resentment, not feeling appreciated, not believing his wife really enjoyed sex, not knowing how to get her to enjoy sex. The problem, of course, is that he wasn't speaking about it. That's a good example where both are in the dark, not feeling good about their connection. Now, if you take that feeling and you put it in front of a TV where everyone is wonderful to look at, airbrushed, perfect sizes, and always sexually ready, the discrepancy can be very, very disappointing and can make us judge ourselves in ways that make us less likely to feel sexual desire. There's hardly a special where suddenly people in an office, in a hospital, in a supply room aren't suddenly sexual. It immediately happens and everybody feels totally gratified. That's not really real life, but it's what we constantly face and constantly see. Another important dimension in gender differences is the meaning of no and the meaning of yes. And I think actually in this regard, men and women are similar. When someone is told no in a way that makes them feel they are rejected or not desired, that is really experienced as a setback in sexual desire. Now, the sad part is sometimes a spouse doesn't know that that's how it's coming across. Gottman in his work suggests we use the soft landing. So, no, I'm tired tonight is very different than, you know, I had the same thought, but I'm so exhausted. Can I take a rain check on that? Because you really look so good tonight. Or I really have been thinking about you today. That's a very different no than no, I'm tired. The other thing I say to couples all the time is if the word no is not allowed, if the relationship is conditional such that you have to say yes, there really is no yes in that relationship. It's simply compliance. There's also no authentic response and no authentic yes. Verbal and nonverbal cues are interesting because men and women are wired to be different in terms of attention to them. What we hear is that men are much more attuned to nonverbal cues of aggression, and women are much more cued to nonverbal cues of sadness, being upset, being grieving, being frightened. It's probably the reason that women will often say to a man, I can't believe you didn't know how I felt. Well, there's a very good chance he could not read that cue, even though you're expert at reading those cues. One of the problems of presumption, which we're all guilty of, is that whatever we know or think is exactly what our partner is knowing or thinking, or if not, we know exactly how they're thinking nonetheless. Some people in the field say, you know, rather than look at just a lack of desire, we ought to consider that sometimes there's a discordant level of desire, that a couple might really be very different. and that is one might have much more of a sexual drive than the other. We seem to find out that the person with the lowest sexual drive is the one who sets the pace. Because if someone initiates or seems to be looking forward to sexual contact that happens far less frequently than they're asking, eventually they back off. And eventually the couple backs down, usually into a place of mediocrity that maybe neither of them are happy with. Often it's worth considering that if you think your partner has less sexual desire than you, it's worth asking, what can I do to really make our love life better for you? That's very different than someone being accused of not being sexual. Let's look at the physical roadblocks that play a part in lower sexual desire. The physical realities that I think everyone knows about is that sometimes with age, with life events, a crisis, a trauma, with illness, with the use of certain medications, addiction or being in recovery from addiction, having a baby, some aspects of menopause, they really create symptoms, feelings that are incompatible with being comfortable and or really eager to be sexual. In these cases, I always suggest that people be as authentic as they can with their partner. If someone really doesn't know that you don't feel well and you just say no, they're not in a position then to be in empathy with you. I think that when couples are able to really let each other know that they miss each other, that they desire each other, but they actually are just recovering from illness, or in fact they're so torn with night sweats or headaches or irregular cycles that they really can't get their sexual desire up to par, that's a very different partner than someone who's simply avoiding and withdrawing. A bigger problem than you would imagine is that both men and women often have some sexual dysfunction. For men, it might be erectile dysfunction. For women, it may be dryness, it may be pain during sexual intercourse. And they not only don't mention this, they avoid sex instead. Maybe adding to that is the problem we see that they don't get help. In the book that Dr. Legato just wrote, which is called Why Men Die First, it's an interesting topic, she tells us 30 million men in the U.S. suffer from erectile dysfunction. Sometimes it's psychological, but often it's medical, due to hypertension, diabetic situations, medications for depressions. The problem is only a small percentage of men will actually go for help. Only a small percentage of men who might benefit from something like Viagra will get the prescription, and only 50% of those prescriptions are filled. So we have a situation often where something could be helped, but people are really quite self-conscious about this. For the sake of themselves and their partner, it's something that we advocate. For women, it might be something they could literally get over the counter. It's something they need to talk to their physician about or their PA about. The whole idea of mutuality in sexual functioning is being at your personal best. If you can't be at your personal best, not only is your partner deprived, but of course you're deprived. And then of course we have the realities of everyday life. It's hard to imagine when you think of people's schedules, when you think of children's schedules, when you think that no one sleeps, everything is opened all night long. You can see a movie and get a pizza at any time of the day. People have all kinds of work schedules, and people are communicating often in a word or a text. There's very little time. What we're going to suggest tonight is one of the things the findings show is you'll never find the time. You'll always have to make the time. And making the time will increase sexual desire because you will have both the anticipation of your plan and you'll have the memories from the encounter. In my work, I find a major roadblock to sexual connection and desire are the judgments we make of ourselves. Men and women are a little different with this. Women are very, very self-judgmental in terms of body image, body size. They expect to be perfect. They presume their partner needs them to look like the Victoria's Secret model or the Vogue model. Actually, in workshops I've done with hundreds of couples, we did a Victoria's Secret vignette, and men stood up and said, yes, we like looking at the catalog, but no, we don't want to sleep with them. We want to sleep with our wives, much to the surprise of the women in the audience. One of the things we also know that in the throes of passion, really the man is not thinking about what size waist you have and how perfect your legs are. The problem is the woman might be thinking about it. And that's one of the things that some of the material that has been written, the book about the Guide to Passionate Sex by Laurie Mintz, she's focusing on how to help women not have their minds wander to that self-judgment place. Men are more worried about performance. They're so worried about performance, as I said before, they'll avoid sexual connection with a partner who will assume it must be me, I'm not tall enough, I'm not young enough, I'm not perfect enough. Actually, no, he's worried that he's not going to be able to sustain an erection. Now, over and over in couples I've worked with, it is startling how relieved men are when they hear a partner say, that's okay, I care about being with you, we will work it out. In almost all situations of sexual functioning and emotional judgments, when couples start to talk, it gets lighter and it becomes more possible. Anger definitely is a factor that plays a part in the lack of sexual desire. Let's talk about the extremes. If we're talking about danger, violence, or abuse of any kind, that disqualifies desire and disqualifies lovemaking. I have said to people, if you're not safe, you cannot stay in that situation, whether you're male or female, nor can your children be in that situation. Now, that being said, I also say to people, if you're in a relationship where it's not safe enough to be angry, you're not in a safe relationship. We know, and I love the way Stephen Mitchell says, he says that aggression is love's shadow. It's an inextricable part of the way we relate to people. In fact, we never get as angry at anyone outside of our partner because we're never as intimately involved with anyone outside of our partner. I recently heard a song that said, I am so enraged with you, I hate you so much, I know it must be true love. So that, you know, that's a very big part of an intense and passionate relationship. The question is not about the fight and not about intense feelings of anger. It's about how a couple recovers and how they make up and how it is they're able to have the possibility of anger side by side with the possibility of passion and love. Here's where a gender difference, I think, is very important to mention. And very often, couples mistake the gender collide with the issue they're fighting about. It's worth men and women knowing that when it comes to anger and stress, men, everybody is infused with cortisol, the stress hormone. But with men, it dissipates within a few hours. With women, it can last 24 hours. Now, if we add that to the fact that when men are angry, they may yell and then they stop talking, women never stop talking. Women reduce their stress by talking. So now you have, he's really coming off the fight. It's 4 hours later. He thinks they're going to the movies. She's still ruminating and saying in her head and often in the room anything and everything about what happened and how he doesn't understand her. The point we get to is the point at which he says, I can't take anymore, and she says, you just don't want to listen to me. So I invite you to consider that if you know that you're wired differently, maybe he realizes she just can't stop talking. Let it be. Let her talk for a while. Maybe she realizes if I stop talking, maybe he'll start talking. So that sometimes we've used gender differences as stereotypes. One of the things I'm suggesting tonight is that we use it much more in the service of information and perspective in terms of our partner. The withholding of sex as a weapon does nothing great to any relationship. nor does silence or the hidden resentments. It's interesting that in the book, The Real Story About Why Men Cheat, by Gary Newman, what he finds is only 8% of the men reported sexual dissatisfaction. 44% of the men reported resentment about not being appreciated, resentment about nobody recognizing that they were trying. There was also a good deal of anger talked about in the surveys of men who had become the quote-unquote sexless husband. So very often we have hidden resentment that really on both sides is keeping sexual connection. Now we talk about make-up sex, and I would say to any couple, if you need to fight because you need to have make-up sex as a way to get together, that's not our first choice. Make-up sex should actually be a point of recovery. And often it's intense because we talk about transfer of intense feelings. Anger's intense, sexual passion's intense. But really, we want to talk about anger management as the best way to enhance sexual desire. It's very interesting to consider, however. Anger management helps sexual desire. Sexual intimacy helps anger management. Sometimes you just have to put down the fight about the wallpaper and continue with the evening. Sometimes you have to accept that you have a working solution and not the final decision of whether you're going to sell the house, and go to the movies and then become intimate that night. An interesting thing happens. Perspective changes and management of anger becomes different. Personal history, we know we all come with baggage. The question is how we use it and whether we use it as a baggage between ourselves and our partners. Here's where authenticity really can make a difference. If somebody really comes with a history of really sexual abuse, someone's really having trouble regulating anxiety, and they share that with their partner, they now have someone who's let in on what they're struggling with and someone who's not as likely to take it personally. We know that self-esteem can really bog down a couple. Often a partner will say, no matter how much I compliment him or her, she doesn't believe it, she tells me I'm crazy. I say to people, when you refuse a compliment, you really refuse intimacy with your partner. Dependency issue is one to consider, and sometimes people need some counseling help with this. If one of the reasons you can't be sexual is because you cannot let go and dare to be dependent, to be gratified by this person that you love, then that's a tremendous loss for both of you and one that you might want to pursue. Over and over we see that a major piece of the emotional roadblocks for men and women are a lack of affirmation, appreciation, and respect. There really is no rule that says, he knows how much I thank him, she knows how much I appreciate her. No, they don't. People love to hear it. An area that I've done a lot of work on is trauma, and I would say trauma is very disruptive to sexual desire, and it's an interesting reason. Stephen Mitchell tells us, and I think you'll all probably understand, that sexual intimacy has as much to do with imagination as anything else. We have to be in the moment. We have to suspend focus on the socks on the floor and the bureau that's not too clean and the fact that we're not perfect and our partner's not perfect. We have to be able to suspend reality to get into imagination, to be sexually aroused. Trauma hits us with too much reality. If you've lost someone you've loved, if you've just lost the house, if somebody's been deployed and wounded, it is very hard to suspend reality. You are riveted in reality. The problem with couples, and all the time I work with couples after trauma, is they don't realize that their relationship is often takes the brunt of the trauma. It also is the answer to recovery. If you notice, I put down some of the physical symptoms of post-traumatic stress, and they're common symptoms after trauma, and they tend to be disruptive of sexual functioning. If you're so hyper-aroused that you cannot sleep, you're not likely to feel sexual. If you are awakened by nightmares, if you are triggered by flashbacks, that's a problem. And often people want to protect their partner from the horror they remember or the intrusive nightmare. Some people really, to protect themselves, go numb. That means they can't feel anything, certainly not sexual connection or arousal. Mood changes are something that we now recognize as part of the symptomatology. So the big piece of this is the psychoeducation that helps us to know in the immediate aftermath of trauma of any kind, some of these symptoms, all or some of them, are very, very normal. They fit the scene. They're not easy. But if a couple is aware of it, they can stay connected in different ways. The woman who awakens the man and says, it's okay, you're safe, and he says, I had a nightmare, and she says, tell me about it, and he says, I don't want to traumatize you. As one nurse said to her husband who was military, she said, I'm a nurse, I've heard it, I'd rather hear it than being left out of what you're facing. So that pulling your partner into what you're facing is also a way to recover together. In one case, maybe some of you saw the movie or read the book or saw the play Down the Rabbit's Hole. It's a good example where after the loss of a child, sexual connection seems irrelevant, maybe even irreverent. And as you see as it unfolds, it actually helps no one. One can hold on to the memory of a loved one, especially if one is together with someone in the dark and you have someone with you. So it's a very, very big disruptor, but trauma is also invites us to join with our partner in recovery. Now, of course, we talked about lots of reasons that disrupt sexual desire, and infidelity is certainly one. Infidelity is a problem because it's traumatic for the partner who is betrayed. And I will tell you that in 66% of those people who've had affairs, men and women, they never expect to have that affair, and most don't want to leave their marriage. In all kinds of reasons, most often they're not sexual reasons. Only 8% of the men who were interviewed had sexual dissatisfaction as their reason, and women often, it's not for sex that they stray. It very often is to recapture a self that's loved and desired and valued, one that they might not have ever felt or once actually felt. Most people want to bring back the feelings they have in the affair to their marriage. Well, they've already disrupted the marriage, and so that has to heal first. One of the things that happens after infidelity very often is that there's a mad rush to reconnect if the couple wants to repair the marriage. And so there's a great deal of sexual connecting, but very often it's out of terror and fear and guilt. It's a start, but it is not the only way to reframe the marriage. I've worked with many couples who have decided after an affair to come back together and begin again, and to have what I call a renewed or a second marriage together. And what that really means, for some it's a leap of faith, but for most couples, I say, if you both want the marriage, then it doesn't matter what anyone else says. You have already the mutuality of the goal. Sexual connection will be an important part, but there'll be lots of steps. Part of it is the apology for the betrayal and living the apology, not just saying it. Part of it is accepting that for the partner who was betrayed, he or she may need to talk about it or ask questions. And I'll say to you that, yes, you need to do that, and we have to be patient with that, but that can't go on for 2 years. When the aftermath of infidelity is a marriage with the original partner that is one of crime and punishment, you do not have repair. You just have a nightmare. And so we need apology, forgiveness, and then the best that happens is the mutual reconsideration of how the heck we got into this situation. And of course, some people will take issue with me saying we, but I'll say that couples that really want their relationship take ownership of what could have happened that wasn't happening. That does not mean, and it never means condoning betrayal, but it means mutually working for a new marriage together, and that new marriage can infuse the couple again with sexual desire. Let's look at some of the strategies, I think I've hinted at some, to enhance sexual desire. So first of all, as I've said before, we want to use the gender differences for self-reflection and perspective-taking, not necessarily just for caricature. It doesn't really work if men decide, I'm not going to speak to her because once I start talking, she never stops. We can't fight civilly because she never ends a fight. Wouldn't it be a different step if he said, I know it's hard for you to not go on and on. Let's do this. I'll talk for 5 minutes. You talk for 5 minutes. Then let's just think about it. We call it the 5 by 5. For some, it's the 10 by 10. But sometimes I say to women, he's not talking because you're not giving him any time to talk. Or if one or the other is talking in a very, very dismissive way, it's not likely that your partner is going to respond. So let's think about the gender differences. One author suggested something that I think is very valuable. We know we have gender differences with desire and arousal. We also know that when couples are infatuated, they are closer neurochemically than at any other time. I also think they're very close after lovemaking. We have an infusion of oxytocin. It's funny. Men are sexual and then they get tender. Women are tender and then they get sexual. So Helen and Susan Peace, in their book, Why Men Don't Listen and Women Can't Read Maps, they suggest, how about this? How about you hold on to what happens in the bedroom outside the bedroom? Would men consider being as tender as you were after sex, even in the kitchen the next morning? Would women like to hold on to the sexual self they were in touch with, their own sexual self, even the next day, in between carpooling? How bad would it be to put on a song you know he likes, or you both once danced to at your wedding, and think about how good it was? Can you hold on to what women and men have a hard time holding on to, and which makes for disconnect? Tenderness on his part, sexuality on her part. Then we all night I've been talking about the importance of talking about sex. But I have to go back and say there's talking, but talking has to have the counterpart of listening. Actually, that's the thing that couples in long-distance relationships do better than anyone else. It's because that is their mode of intimacy. So they're talking and they're listening and they are saying, I hear you, I support you, I validate you. If you're many, many miles away and you want that, feel close to that partner, you're not only talking and listening, you're rereading texts, you're re-listening to voicemails. If only we could take a little bit of that into our everyday relationships. Now, laughing is a very big part of sexual intimacy. I think it's a Starbucks cup that says, and it's from Victor Borges, I think, the closest distance between two people is laughter. And I think one way to soften the intimidation of talking about sex is to know you can sprinkle it with humor. So if you're asking him, what body part should you grab? Or he's asking you, okay, what should I wear that would be sexy? What should I wear a bikini? If you're able to start really talking, just the talking invites the sexual desire because you're thinking of each other in sexual terms. In as much as I'm saying that, it often makes sense also for someone to say, I feel like I'm invisible to you. You never compliment me. That could be a man or a woman. It's important for someone to say, don't expect me to be ready for sexual responsiveness when you're not doing anything that turns me on. I need to help you understand what is the turn on for me. Or one asking the other, what else should I learn about this that might make a difference? It's about curiosity. When in doubt, being curious, being willing to laugh at each other, and particularly at yourself, really enhances things. Personal care, attitude, and desirability. You know, you can say, he's overweight. He can say, you're not dressed in sexy clothes. The real issue is self-care. What sense of responsibility are you taking for your own physical desirability? Men are more visually attuned, but women often say they wish their spouse also took pride in his looks and in how he dressed. Attitude and self-confidence is desirable in anybody we see. The plan is what we mentioned before. In this culture, you may want to hope for spontaneous. It's not likely to happen. It's like when someone says, let's catch up and have dinner sometime. You know that's not happening. But the people who call you and say, can you come over October 5th? That's a date. So the more you plan to be sexual, and that doesn't mean every night, and it might mean for a couple once a month. It's their plan, but the anticipation is valuable. That's the hot date. Everything we read tells us that the novel, the unexpected, the hotel room make a difference. In the hotel room, you're thinking sexually. You're not thinking of the laundry, and you're not thinking of the emails that you have to answer. You're thinking that this room is perfect. This room has no towels on the floor. This room, I can feel sexy in this room. So, I mean, I think Labotin in one of his Site Today blogs says, you know what, there's something to be said about hotel rooms. There's also something to be said about unexpected places. Maybe you can't afford a hotel room. So maybe you take the car and you drive to the beach. It's also often in the details. It's the note you leave under her pillow. It's the sexy text you send him. It's the unexpected that keeps the sexual arousal and the interest in sex alive. No one shows up for a good sexual relationship, whether they are in their 20s or in their 70s. It takes working it and wanting to. Think how many times we renovate homes and we buy new cars. Why wouldn't we continue to renovate and infuse relationships? Memory is, of course, crucial to desire, and we say the best impetus to a sexual encounter is the memory of the last good encounter. So the more sexual connection couples have, in whatever form they do it, and we should broaden the topic, because whether it's caressing in a movie or intercourse, it has to matter to the couple, and it could mean intimacy to them. The use of social media and media, this can be used for or against you as a couple. If it replaces your partner, if it becomes cyber sex, online affairs, it disqualifies your relationship. It's betrayal, it's dismissal, it's replacement. When it becomes an addiction, it's like any other addiction. On the other hand, as we see with our long-distance couples, it can be a wonderful way of staying connected in tiny little sound bites over the course of a week, over the course of a day. Over and over again, men and women say that what's connected to their sexual desire is the feeling that the other is providing them with attention, appreciation, and affirmation. It doesn't have to be a formal speech. I say to couples all the time, the expression we've used now in this culture in subways and airports, if you see something, say something. Say something positive. When you tell her she looks great in that sweater, or she tells you the haircut is great, you carry that all day, and that makes a difference. So in renewing sexual desire, I'm inviting you to talk, listen, touch, look, laugh, escape in any order. Zoe, let's open it up for questions.
All right. Can you hear me?
Hello?
Hi.
Okay, hi, I got you.
Hi there. Thank you. Thank you so much for that presentation. That was just great. I'm just trying to cue up my screen. There we go. There we go. Okay. So thank you so much for that presentation, Suzanne. We do have a question. Let's see, the first one. And I have a few questions too, actually. I was just finding that so interesting, and I'm madly writing down notes here. Okay, so a question from one of our attendees is, what about if your husband sneaks to the bathroom to watch media when I am in the bed?
Okay, so the real question is, how do we speak about it? Because we can make all kinds of assumptions. He doesn't want to be with me. He's connecting with someone else. He needs cyber sex to get turned on. We really don't know. All might be true. But certainly being in the bed while he's in the bathroom is a disconnect. So it would seem to me that what might be a first step is to say, you know, I'm even uncomfortable talking about this, and I'm not sure what it means, but I don't know what to think when you're in the bathroom checking on media, and I'm in the bed waiting for you. I'm sort of saying to our attendee, I think this is a great question because it bears on how do we go from our worry or the observation of our partner's behavior that seems not too sexually interested to beginning a dialogue about it that doesn't come on as so accusational that it ends the dialogue before we start it.
Exactly. Yeah, that seems to make a lot of sense. And, you know, this really does tie into a comment, Suzanne, that I had, and maybe we could sort of explore the two of them in this way, and that is, you know, watching media while I'm in bed, and you did write a blog post about cyber sex addiction. I think this is something that I know is of concern to the folks in my particular group of adults with ADHD. In other words, the partner is interested in a technical cyber reality as opposed to the reality of their partner. How do you get at that? Like, how do you get at an actual addiction? Does one need therapy to address that, or?
Well, the question that you're asking, there's two questions here. The one is, what do you do when you find your partner watching porn or cyber sex? And so we start out by saying, you know, couples are different. Sometimes both want to watch porn, but sometimes both are into cyber sex. That's different than when you come upon your partner doing this. And like anything else, to be curious and concerned is very different than to be judgmental. Sometimes we've had folks who've been in situations, they may have, whether it's been they've lived alone a long time, and that was a form of sexual arousal for them. And so we don't really know what's behind the use of it. So to open it up as a couple conversation is certainly one way. To decide, some couples decide what, you know, don't ask, don't think about it, and they let it go. When you have cyber sex addiction, however, it usually means the replacement of intimacy with your partner with a need for stimulation from this media. Like any other addiction, the problem with it is that it disrupts life's functioning. It becomes worse and worse because it becomes a tolerance for it. You need more and more of it. In some ways, people have lost not only their marriages, they've lost their jobs because they're doing it at work. So cyber sex addiction becomes a much more serious situation to deal with. And if you read my blog on it, one of our problems is that in other forms of recovery, you know, you remove yourself from persons, places, and things. Well, you might remove yourself from cyber sex, but you're on the computer all the time, which is a trigger to the very thing you're addicted to. So it's really very difficult. It's very difficult for the partner. But there's almost no reason that people cannot get help. It's the not getting help. that destroys the relationships.
Okay, that's great. Suzanne, I want to move on if you don't mind. Thank you so much for that. We've got a couple more questions. The next one is, what is the best way to, quote, suspend reality and engage your imagination? I love that.
I think that people can do it in very different ways. For some people, it's music. Now, for men, it's, as I say, easier because visually that is the turn on for them. So remembering something that was visually attractive, remembering their partner, noticing what she's wearing, noticing a body part. For women, it often actually takes some effort. Now, I think that one of the blog I just wrote was on the use of Read Your Way to Increase Sexual Desire. And one of the things that we have evidence-based now is that some erotic literature, it could be romance novels. I mean, some people got into 50 Shades. That's not for everyone. But sometimes for women, reading something that is sexually arousing gives them a context for fantasizing. Seeing a romantic X-rated or even R-rated film with your partner and then being sexual, it can be a great deal of fun and can be a way to enhance fantasy. One of the things that Laurie Mintz says, and really her book is A Tired Woman's Guide to Passionate Sex. What she's really saying is, just like you sort of get good at anything else, she's inviting women to really own their sexuality by thinking more about sex. So if you see a movie, if you read a novel, if you remember how your husband looks at a certain time, whether it's at the beach or was it at your wedding or is it when he's doing something athletic, take a Kodak of that in your mind and give yourself permission to kind of suspend your worry about the laundry, the socks. That's harder for women. Here's the thing, though. If women knew that the more they did this, the more they were able to do this, I think that they would feel entitled to think more about sex and sexuality. I mean, everybody's been brought up in different cultures, and that may play a part in it, too. But so that's a long answer to use whatever it takes to enhance fantasy.
Okay, thanks, Suzanne. I'm aware we only have a couple minutes, and there are a couple other questions. One is from one of our attendees, and a burning one from me. One of our participants says that they're into porn, and they would watch it, but he makes me despise it. Now, I did ask the attendee to expand on that. But they didn't. They chose not to. So the question is, I'm into porn and would watch it with him, but he makes me despise it.
Actually, that's a really great question because that has come up with folks, and that is, does he know that he makes you despise it? You see, he has in you a very open-minded partner. But I'm very aware, if this is what you're referring to, that when someone says, see that move, would you do that? I need that. It is a complete turn-off to the partner. So that he may need to know, we could benefit from this if you did this or didn't say that. In some way you're making it not appealing. Remember in the earlier tonight I said, if reality interferes with the imagination, it's like cold water on sexual arousal. He may need to know, I could be into this, but I don't think you're realizing you're kind of turning it around for me.
Wow, that is, I didn't think of that. Fantastic, Suzanne. Thank you so much. Before we wrap up, I want to say that we have a comment from one of our attendees who says that your presentation was transformational, and she wants to thank you very, very much for that.
Oh, thank you.
And finally, I would love to ask you, I have been reading and thinking and listening a lot about this topic, and I want to know what your thoughts are on the lack of information and knowledge that women have about our own bodies. I'm thinking about the book of Vagina by Naomi Wolf that was released within the last year. I'm thinking about a visual and installation artist who just did this incredible video called Clitoracy. And I'm thinking about how, you know, in Naomi Wolf's book, she says that women are capable of many different kinds of orgasms. She's got a chapter called What We, quote, know about female sexuality is out of date. So the general question is, do women, in your view, need to learn more about their body parts and their own sexuality, especially our physiology, in response to it? And if so, what would you suggest that we do to get ourselves up to speed on what works for us sexually?
Okay, well, what I would say is it's not that they need to, but that they need to give themselves the entitlement to. And people are very different. If it gets too graphic and too body part, that may be a turn off for some. It's so interesting to me. Those are women authors. 50 Shades is a woman author, typical mom, typical kind of shy lady, typical mom, typical wife. The show on HBO, Girls, a new show called Afternoon Delight. It's so interesting to me that women seem to be more comfortable learning and being entitled to learn about their sexuality from other women. It's a very important first step. I think there remains always kind of the double standard. And young women, thankfully, are much, much more open to their freedom to be and their freedom to know. So I think, the short answer is everyone needs to do it their own way, but that there is more available to see and to identify with is a gift to women.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Yes, I have more comments coming in, and that's really a shame because we need to wrap up now. We have some more thanks and kudos on your presentation. I wanted to share that with everyone. So, Suzanne, did you want to make a couple of final remarks to wrap up, and then I'm going to wish everyone a good evening.
Okay, I did want to thank everybody for listening. I can't underscore enough the idea that don't wait to feel the intimacy, the desire, or the closeness to be sexual. Consider that you're going to feel intimacy, closeness, and desire as a result of being sexual. I also want to leave you with this quote, which is that new love is the brightest and long love is the greatest, but revived love is the tenderest thing known on earth. And that's from Thomas Hardy.
Thank you so much. So I would love to thank everyone who joined us tonight for our Psych Central webinar. And I'd like to thank Psych Central for hosting the webinar. And again, Suzanne, Dr. Phillips, thank you very, very much. It was a wonderful presentation. I'd like to invite also everyone, don't forget to visit Dr. Phillips at her Psych Central blog, Healing Together for Couples. Pick up a copy of her latest book, Healing Together, A Couple's Guide to Coping with Trauma and Post-Traumatic Stress. And please do visit Psych Central's YouTube channel to listen to this webinar again and also to other webinars. And to access Suzanne's list of references, we're going to post them on the replay so that you can get lots and lots of valuable resources there. So everyone, thank you so much again. I'm Zoe Kessler. I hope you'll join us again at our next Psych Central webinar. So long for now.